The courthouse had been quiet for exactly 8 seconds before everything changed. Not the kind of quiet that comes from emptiness, the kind that comes from a room full of people collectively holding their breath. Deputies straightened up. Reporters stopped mid-sentence. Even the bailiff, a man who had seen every kind of human drama inside that building, turned slowly toward the entrance. Because something was coming. You could feel it before you could hear it. Heavy boots. Steady rhythm. The kind of steps that don't rush for anyone. 3 men walked through those courthouse doors wearing worn leather vests, road dust still on their jackets. Outside, motorcycles lined the street for half a block. Inside, every pair of eyes followed those 3 men as they walked slowly down the center aisle. A reporter leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "Who are these guys?" Nobody had a good answer. Not yet. At the defense table sat a woman with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Eleanor Hayes. 71 years old. Gray hair pulled back. A worn cable-knit sweater. She wasn't looking at the crowd or at the men who had just entered. Her eyes were fixed on a single paper cup of water she hadn't touched. She had spent 40 years opening her door to people nobody else wanted. And now she was the one sitting in a courtroom, accused of stealing from the very shelter she had built with her own hands. But those 3 men weren't there to watch her lose. They were there because 23 years earlier, she had done something nobody else was willing to do. She had opened that door for them. To understand what happened in that courtroom, you have to go back to a small house on the edge of a struggling mill town in central Tennessee. Eleanor and her husband Raymond had lived there their whole lives. Raymond worked at the mill. Eleanor ran a small community meals program out of the church basement, a folding table, some pots, and a lot of Saturday mornings. They had no children of their own. They had each other, and they had that town. For a long time, that had been enough. Raymond Hayes died of a heart attack in the spring of 2001, 3 weeks after his 58th birthday. Eleanor sat alone in that house for 2 months, listening to the silence of a life built for 2. She kept the meals program going, not because anyone told her to, but because she didn't know what else to do with herself on Saturday mornings. And then one night in November, everything changed. It was raining hard. Eleanor was still awake, sitting with a cup of tea she'd forgotten to drink, when she heard something on the porch. She opened the door and found a boy. 14 years old. A garbage bag with 2 changes of clothes, a busted lip, and eyes that had already learned not to ask for too much. His name was Reed Callahan. He'd been in and out of 3 foster placements since he was 9. He didn't say much. Just stood there in the rain. Eleanor stepped back and opened the door wider. "You're soaking wet," she said. "Come inside." That's how it started. Not with paperwork. Not with a plan. Just a woman stepping back from her own door to let someone in. Before we go any further, where are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments, we'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's get back to Eleanor. Over the following months, 2 more boys found their way to her house. The second was Caleb Whitmore, 16, quiet, more guarded than Reed. He didn't get into fights, but he had a watchfulness about him that comes from years of tracking every shift in mood just to stay safe. He was remarkably sharp. Teachers had flagged him for years as a kid with real potential. But potential only grows if someone waters it. Eleanor saw that within 2 weeks. The third boy arrived that summer. Noah Briggs. 12 years old. The smallest, the most frightened. He barely spoke above a whisper for the first 3 weeks. He flinched at sudden sounds. He ate quickly, like someone who'd learned that food doesn't always stay where you leave it. Eleanor didn't push him. She just made sure there was a plate for him at every meal and that the lamp in the hallway stayed on after dark. None of these boys were related. Eleanor hadn't planned for any of this. She was a widow with limited savings, a house in need of repairs, a small income from the church office, and no training in child welfare whatsoever. What she had was a spare bedroom, a willingness to stay up late, and a belief that every kid deserves at least one person in their corner. So she became that person. 3 times over. Life in that house was not easy. Eleanor took on extra shifts, cleaning offices 2 evenings a week, working weekends at a catering company, selling things at the flea market she didn't really want to sell. She repaired the boys' clothes when they tore. There were nights she told them she'd already eaten when she hadn't, just so they'd finish what was on the table without worrying. Reed figured it out first. He came into the kitchen one night and found her eating the last spoonfuls of cold soup straight from the pot after the dishes were cleared. Neither of them said anything. Then Reed put his jacket on and said he was going to see if the gas station down the road needed someone on weekends. He didn't frame it as helping Eleanor. He just did it. That was Reed. He showed everything through action, nothing through words. One evening Eleanor gathered all 3 at the kitchen table. She looked at each of them and said, "Promise me something. When you grow up, become good men. That's all I'm asking." The overhead light buzzed slightly. Each of them said they would. They meant it. That promise would matter more than any of them knew. The years passed. The boys grew up and moved on. Reed enlisted in the army at 18, served 2 tours, and eventually settled in Knoxville, where he found his footing through a motorcycle brotherhood, a chapter of former military men and working-class guys who rode together and looked out for each other. Caleb got scholarships, put himself through college, and built a small logistics consulting business in Nashville. He called Eleanor every Sunday without fail. She was the only person he called on Sundays. Noah became a community outreach coordinator in Memphis working with homeless youth, which makes perfect sense when you understand what he knew about needing a lamp left on in the hallway. Eleanor hadn't been idle either. She formalized what she'd been doing for years and registered a nonprofit. She called it Hayes House. It grew steadily, a real shelter for youth in crisis, built on one principle: every person coming through the door deserved to be treated like they mattered. For years the community embraced it. Donations came in. The city noticed. A good reputation, built brick by brick. Then, about 2 years before the courtroom scene you saw at the beginning, a man named Daniel Mercer started showing up. Mercer was a developer, the polished kind, the kind who wears excellent shoes and talks about community investment. He wanted the block where Hayes House sat. It was close to a transit corridor, next to a neighborhood starting to gentrify. more valuable than it looked. He made Eleanor a fair offer. She turned it down without much deliberation. She'd built that shelter in that location specifically because it was accessible to the people who needed it most. Mercer shook her hand, said he respected her mission, and left. His expression, walking out, didn't match his words. It was the face of a man who had simply changed his approach, not his objective. Weeks later, police vehicles appeared outside Eleanor's house. The accusation was financial fraud. Specifically, misappropriation of non-profit funds, just over $80,000, allegedly moved out of Hayes' house accounts over 18 months in ways that didn't match the shelter's expenditures. The documentation looked damning. Transaction records. Account numbers. Dates. A paper trail that, on the surface, pointed directly at Eleanor. The news traveled fast. And the reaction was painful in that quiet way betrayals by omission always are. Donors went silent. A longtime board member resigned by email. People who had praised Eleanor publicly suddenly became unavailable. She sat alone in her living room in the evenings, the same room where 3 boys had once done homework, alone in a way she hadn't been since the months after Raymond died. Her attorney was honest. Without records that could explain where the money actually went, the outcome wasn't certain. The problem was that several key financial documents from Hayes' house had gone missing. Not incomplete. Missing. That's a different thing entirely. Reed got the call on a Thursday, standing in a parking lot in Knoxville. Eleanor's neighbor explained what had happened. Reed stood very still for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll call you back." He stood there another few seconds, then called Caleb. The message was 3 words, "It's Eleanor. Come." That was enough. Caleb cleared his schedule and was on the road within 2 hours. Then Reed called Noah in Memphis. Same message. Noah said, "When and where?" They hadn't been in the same room in nearly 4 years. But they came back together the way people do when the thing that matters most is threatened. No ceremony. Just 3 men converging on Eleanor's town, arriving within hours of each other, standing in her living room while she made coffee she didn't need to make just to have something to do with her hands. They looked at her. She looked at them. And the years collapsed between them like they'd never existed. They started digging. Caleb worked through every financial record Eleanor still had, building a timeline. Reed tracked down former shelter clients, looking for anyone who'd noticed something. Noah worked his nonprofit contacts quietly. Obstacles came fast. Witnesses who'd initially supported Eleanor became vague. One former shelter staff member met with Noah visibly shaken, spoke in generalities, and left early. Noah noticed he'd arrived in a car he couldn't possibly afford on a shelter worker's salary. Reed filed that away. Then someone put a note under Reed's windshield wiper outside Eleanor's house. It said simply, "Leave it alone." Reed folded it carefully, put it in his jacket pocket, and told Caleb to back up everything to 3 separate drives. Caleb's breakthrough came first. He'd been tracing the missing funds through transaction records, running recipient account numbers through financial databases. The money hadn't vanished. It had moved, routed through 2 layers of holding companies before landing in an account attached to a property development consulting firm. Noah found the second piece. Mercer didn't just control his development company. Through a series of connected LLCs and advisory boards, he had quiet influence over a community investment fund that had recently taken on grant review oversight for small nonprofits in the region, including Hayes House. He had the access. Caleb had found the money. Someone had constructed this, deliberately and carefully, to look like Eleanor had stolen from her own shelter. The third discovery was Reed's. And it wasn't what he was looking for. He was staying in Eleanor's house, in the same room he'd used as a teenager, when he found an old shoebox on the top shelf of the hallway closet. He wasn't intending to open it. But the lid shifted, and he saw what was inside. Letters. Envelopes, never mailed. Each one addressed in Eleanor's handwriting. One for Reed. One for Caleb. One for Noah. He sat down on the hallway floor and read his. Eleanor had been writing to them for years. Newspaper clippings. A photo from a community event. A brief article about a veterans' ride Reed had organized. Birthday notes, written on the actual dates, never sent. And one line that stopped him completely: I never wanted them to feel abandoned again. He sat on that floor for a long time. Then he went downstairs, poured a glass of water, and stood at the kitchen window, the same window that looked out over the backyard where Eleanor had once taught Noah how to grow tomatoes. He didn't say much for the rest of that evening. He didn't need to. They brought everything to Eleanor's attorney 2 weeks before trial. The financial trail. The organizational connections. The missing records. The threatening note. The full timeline. The attorney went through all of it, then looked up and said, "This is enough to present." Eleanor sat at the end of the table and looked at the 3 men across from her: Reed, who had come back from 2 tours of war and still showed up; Caleb, who had built a life from nothing and still showed up; Noah, who spent his days fighting for kids who reminded him of himself and still showed up. She didn't say thank you. She just looked at them. That was Eleanor. The morning of the trial, Reed called his chapter brothers. He didn't make a speech. He just said where he was going and why. By 6 in the morning, 27 motorcycles were staged at a gas station outside town. They rode in together, parked in a long row on the street, and 3 men in leather vests walked through those courthouse doors while everyone inside stopped talking. You already know how it looked. Now you know why. The trial lasted 3 days. Eleanor's attorney laid out the evidence piece by piece: the altered records, the shell structure, the full timeline. A board member from one of Mercer's affiliated organizations, given immunity, testified he'd been asked to sign documents he hadn't fully read. The former shelter employee declined to testify, invoking his Fifth Amendment rights. That told its own story. By the end of the second day, the prosecution was quietly reassessing. On the morning of the third day, the charges against Eleanor Hayes were dropped. The courtroom went silent in a different way than it had at the beginning. This was the silence of something settling. Eleanor sat very still. Reed moved first. He walked to where she was sitting and knelt down beside her, this man who had been 14 years old and soaking wet on her porch, and put his hand over hers. She was crying. Quietly, the way people cry when they've been holding something too long. Reed said, "You carried us when nobody wanted us. He paused. Now it's our turn. Eleanor covered her face with her other hand. Caleb and Noah stood behind her. Nobody said a word. And I want to ask you something. If you had given everything you had for decades, been let down by everyone who should have shown up, and then the three people you loved most walked through that door to fight for you, what would that do to you? Tell me in the comments. I'm genuinely reading every single one. Mercer faced a separate civil investigation. The property stayed exactly where it was. 3 months after the charges were dropped, Eleanor reopened Hayes' house. A local sign company, whose owner's son had once stayed at the shelter, donated a new sign. It read, Hayes House. Underneath, in smaller letters, no child forgotten. When someone later told Eleanor they were sorry for not believing her, she said, "Don't hate people for being afraid. Fear makes people small. But it doesn't have to stay that way. Family isn't always who shares your blood. Sometimes it's who stays. Sometimes it's who opens the door in the rain and asks nothing in return." 23 years earlier, one lonely widow let 3 forgotten boys inside. She never kept a ledger. She never asked for repayment. She just kept the lamp on and made sure there was a plate at every meal. But life has a strange way of returning what love gives away. What's your take on this story? Comment below. I'm reading every single one. If this moved you, hit the like button and send it to someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, check out the other videos on this channel.